In the forensic archives of American capitalism, the name Brown and Williamson represents a terrifying anomaly. Usually, the perpetrator is found at the scene of the crime, but this dynasty committed the ultimate act of extraction. They didn't just sell tobacco, they trafficked in the slow, rhythmic suffocation of the human race, constructing their marble mansions on a foundation of calcified arteries and liquefied lungs. Yet while their competitors held on to their toxic empires, until the bitter end, the Brown family executed a masterstroke of survival. They built the machine, they profited from the slaughter, and then, in a moment of cold calculation, they vanished. This is the timeline of a hit and run on a global scale. How a family traded the gray ash of the cigarette for the golden amber of the whiskey, leaving the world to choke on the smoke while they toasted to their own impunity. The Founder's Gambit and the Great Severance. The investigation begins in the soot-stained, humidity-choked streets of Louisville, Kentucky, in the dying years of the 19th century. The year is 1893. Imagine the atmosphere of this place. It was not a city of gentle dreams. It was a crucible of post-Civil War ambition. The air in Louisville was thick, heavy with the black smoke of coal burning in the boilers of steamboats on the Ohio River, mingled with the sour mash of fermenting whiskey and the pungent, earthy sweetness of tobacco curing in vast wooden warehouses. This was the Gilded Age, a time when old orders were collapsing and new industrial tycoons were rising from the ash. In this chaotic world of grit and money, George Garvin Brown emerged not merely as a merchant, but as a chemist of desire. Modern business history primarily remembers George Garvin Brown as the revered patriarch of the spirits industry, the man who founded Brown-Forman and created the legendary Old Forester, the first bourbon sold in sealed glass bottles to ensure medicinal purity. But that is only half of the forensic dossier. The other half, darker and less discussed at charity galas, is the fact that Brown was a man who deeply understood the duality of human frailty. He looked at the men returning from the coal mines, with soot in their pores, the dock workers with calloused hands, the veterans with shattered souls. He understood that they were in pain, and to soothe that pain, they sought relief in two specific forms: the burn of alcohol in the stomach and the bite of smoke in the lungs. One to forget the reality, and one to stimulate the nerves to endure it. So in 1893, partnering with Robert Watson Williamson, he formed the Brown and Williamson Tobacco Company. Forensically, it is crucial to distinguish the Brown era from the horror that came later. George Garvin Brown was a product man. He was not a financial wolf sitting in an air-conditioned office manipulating stock prices. He was a tactile operator. He walked the factory floors that vibrated with the rhythm of threshing machines. He inhaled the dust of the burley and flue-cured leaf. He tasted the molasses and licorice used for the casing. Under his stewardship, the company was dangerous, certainly, because tobacco is inherently carcinogenic, but it was an honest danger. The cigarette of the late 19th century was a primitive agricultural product. It was unfiltered, harsh, and brutal. It was a bundle of dried leaves wrapped in rice paper. There were no hidden ammonia injectors. There was no genetic modification. There were no laser-drilled vents on the filter to cheat testing machines. George Garvin Brown treated tobacco with the same mindset he applied to whiskey: quality, purity, and class. He did not view his customers as biological units to be optimized for addiction, but as patrons of a gentleman's habit. He was a purveyor of poison, yes, but a purveyor with the conscience of the 19th century. However, this agricultural innocence was destined to be executed by the wheel of history. As the 20th century dawned, it brought with it the roar of the internal combustion engine and global mechanization. The tobacco industry stood on the precipice of a terrifying evolution. The invention of the Bonsack automatic rolling machine, monopolized by his competitor James Duke, changed the velocity of death. Previously, a skilled worker could roll a few thousand cigarettes a day. Now machines could vomit out millions. Tobacco was transforming from a leisure activity into a mass market necessity. It was becoming the symbol of modernity, of the soldier in the trenches of World War I, of the liberated woman in the flapper era. George Garvin Brown and his family watched this shift with growing anxiety. They saw their competitors, the American Tobacco Company, R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, mutating into industrial leviathans. The war for market share was no longer a contest of leaf quality. It was becoming a total war of advertising, price undercutting, and supply chain dominance. The Brown family, by now established aristocrats of the South, felt the heat rising. They stood at the crossroads of history. On their right hand, they held the whiskey empire, dignified, culturally rich, and granting them entry into the highest tiers of society. Even with prohibition looming, they knew the core value of the spirit was gold. On their left hand, they held Brown and Williamson, a grinding, dirty business that demanded they get into the mud. To compete in this new era, they would have to get their hands dirty. They would have to industrialize the addiction process. And this is where the survival instinct of the Brown lineage kicked in. It was not the instinct of a warrior, but the instinct of a brilliant investor, knowing when to leave the casino. They saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. They saw the ruthlessness of monopoly capitalism. And most importantly, they saw a chance to wash their hands before the blood really started to flow. In 1927, the Brown family made the decision that would define the next century of forensic history. Faced with the escalating brutality of the tobacco wars, they did not choose to fight in the trenches. Instead, they chose to cash out, committing what history now recognizes as the Great Severance. In a boardroom transaction that was likely quiet, civil, and suffocated by the smell of cigar smoke, the heirs of the Brown dynasty sold Brown and Williamson to British American Tobacco, BAT. To understand the gravity of this moment, one must understand the nature of the buyer. Based in London, BAT was not merely a company, it was a commercial empire, a monopoly born from a truce between American and British tobacco titans. They operated with the cold, detached efficiency of colonial administrators. They possessed no sentimental attachment to the soil of Kentucky, nor did they care about the respiratory health of the American worker. Their objective was singular: global extraction. The sale was the original sin of the dynasty's timeline. The Brown family took the payout, millions of dollars in 1920s currency, a staggering fortune, and they walked away. They took this capital, which was now meticulously scrubbed of any future liability, and reinvested it into their whiskey barrels. They retreated to the safe, manicured lawns of their estates in the highlands of Louisville, leaving the dirty work to others. By handing the keys of the Louisville factories to the British, they effectively decapitated the company's conscience, severing the link between the creator and the creation. From the moment the ink dried on the contract in 1927, Brown and Williamson ceased to be a family business in anything but name. It underwent a structural mutation, transforming into a colonial outpost. This distinction is vital for the forensic profile of the crimes that followed. When a company is owned by a local family, there is a lingering natural sense of shame that acts as a restraint. You have to look your neighbors in the eye at church, and you have to live in the same air you pollute. But when a company is owned by a faceless conglomerate across the Atlantic Ocean, shame is replaced by the algorithm of profit. The executives who were sent to run the Louisville operations were no longer patriarchs like George Garvin Brown. They were proxies. They were middle managers and corporate climbers, answering to a board of directors in London who viewed the American South simply as a resource colony, a place to grow the leaf, manufacture the poison, and harvest the revenue. The Brown name remained on the factory sign, but this was merely a calculated piece of camouflage. It assured the Kentucky locals that this was still their company, a pillar of Southern tradition. But inside the boardroom, the accents had changed and the directives had become ruthless. The goal was no longer to make the best Kentucky burley. The goal was to crush competitors like Philip Morris, no matter the human cost. The factory had become a puppet, dancing to strings pulled from London. This sale created a terrifying psychological environment within the corporation, marking the 0 hour for the atrocities that would follow. Because the Brown family had exited, the moral guardian of the enterprise was gone. There was no longer anyone in the room to say no when the science turned dark. When the chemists later suggested adding ammonia to freebase the nicotine, there was no Brown to stop them. When the marketers suggested targeting children to replace dying customers, there was no family honor to defend. When the scientists proposed the genetically modified Y1 plant, it was approved by the proxies without hesitation because their only loyalty was to the quarterly report. The Brown family had successfully washed their hands. They had exited the crime scene before the true crime began. They left behind a hollow shell of a corporation, a hungry machine waiting for a new master. And the new masters, the mercenaries, were about to arrive. They would bring with them not the agricultural knowledge of the founder, but the cold, sterile science of the laboratory. They would turn the factory into a chemical weapons plant, and they would do it under the cover of the very name the family had sold. The autopsy of the founder's era concludes here. The patient, the original agricultural soul of the company, died in 1927. What continued to walk the earth was a zombie, animated by British capital and American chemistry, the reign of the mercenaries, and the ammonia protocol. With the abdication of the Brown family in 1927, a moral vacuum was created in the executive suites of Louisville. Nature abhors a vacuum, but capitalism fills it with mercenaries. The era of British-American tobacco's control brought forth a new species of leader, the corporate technocrat. These were men who did not inherit the land. They were hired to strip mine it. They had no sentimental attachment to the golden leaf, nor did they have to face the neighbors whose lungs were blackening in the local hospitals. They were transient executioners, paid in stock options and performance bonuses, tasked with a single, cold directive from their masters in London: maximize the yield of the human nervous system. The agricultural era of the tobacco industry was officially dead. The chemical era had begun. Under the guidance of these mercenaries, the factory ceased to be a place where plants were processed and became a place where molecules were manipulated. The new executives looked at the cigarette not as a pleasure to be savored, but as a unit of dosage to be optimized. They understood that their true competitor was not another brand, but the human body's natural ability to resist addiction. To win the market, they had to overcome biology itself. By the 1960s, the mercenaries were facing an existential crisis. They were losing the war for the American lung. Their rival, Philip Morris, had launched the Marlboro Man campaign, capturing the imagination of the country and dominating the market with a product that smokers claimed tasted better and hit harder. Brown and Williamson was falling behind, trapped with fading brands like Viceroy that were seen as weak and outdated. The executives in Louisville were desperate. They knew that marketing alone could not save them. They needed a technological advantage. They turned their eyes from the tobacco fields to the R&D department. This marked the militarization of the company's science division. The laboratories at Brown and Williamson were expanded and shielded from public view, transforming into facilities that looked less like food processing plants and more like weapons depots. Men in white coats replaced the old tobacco blenders. These were chemists, toxicologists, and neurologists who spoke a language not of aroma and flavor, but of pH levels, alkaloids, and blood-brain barrier penetration. They were given a mandate that was as vague as it was menacing: make the smoker dependent and do it faster. In the quiet, sterile hum of the laboratories during the late 1960s and early 1970s, the scientists at Brown and Williamson conducted the experiments that would redefine the ethics of capitalism. This was not a discovery made by farmers. It was a molecular heist committed by chemists. They began to dissect the nicotine alkaloid to understand why some cigarettes satisfied the craving while others failed. They discovered that in nature, the nicotine molecule exists in a state of chemical captivity known as being protonated. It is a salt, chemically bound to an acid. In this natural state, the nicotine molecule is a clumsy, slow-moving giant. It resists vaporization. When a smoker inhales natural tobacco smoke, the nicotine struggles to cross the membranes of the body, resulting in a slow, gentle absorption that offers a mild stimulation. The mercenaries realized that this natural speed limit was bad for business. They wanted a weapon that didn't just satisfy. They wanted a weapon that conquered. They discovered that by flooding the tobacco blend with ammonia-based compounds, such as diammonium phosphate, they could artificially raise the pH of the smoke, making it more alkaline. This chemical alteration acted as a key, unlocking the acidic handcuffs of the nicotine molecule. The proton was stripped away, transforming the drug into free-base nicotine. The forensic significance of this ammonia alchemy is terrifyingly simple. Free-base nicotine is lipophilic, meaning it loves fat. This chemical property allows it to slice through the cell membranes of the lungs and the blood-brain barrier with the velocity of a narcotic airstrike. Instead of a slow rise in blood nicotine levels, the ammonia-treated smoke delivers a massive, instantaneous spike. The drug reaches the brain in 7 seconds. 7 seconds. That is the window of enslavement. The mercenaries had effectively turned the cigarette into a crack pipe. The distinction between natural tobacco smoke and ammonia-treated smoke is chemically identical to the distinction between powder cocaine and crack cocaine. One is a recreational drug, the other is a neurological sledgehammer. Internal documents from this period, which would lay buried for decades in the company's secret archives, reveal the sociopathic detachment of the leadership. They discussed impact boosting and nicotine kick with the casual tone of men discussing the weather. They knew they were not enhancing flavor. They were hacking the dopamine reward pathway, creating a product that the user's brain would interpret as being as vital to survival as food or oxygen. While the ammonia opened the door to the brain, the mercenaries needed a second chemical key to keep the throat from rejecting the poison. They found it in menthol. Historically, Brown and Williamson's flagship brand was Cool. For decades, they marketed it with imagery of snow-capped mountains and penguins, promising a fresh sensation. But forensically, menthol is not a flavor. It is a local anesthetic. It is a biological trick. The smoke from burning tobacco is naturally hot and harsh. It triggers the body's cough reflex, a survival mechanism designed to expel toxins. The chemists at B&W discovered that by coating the tobacco in heavy doses of menthol, they could numb the nerve endings in the throat and bronchial tubes. This was the anesthetic mask. It allowed the smoker to inhale deeper and hold the smoke longer without coughing. It was particularly effective on new recruits, teenagers whose lungs were still pink and sensitive. By numbing the warning system of the body, cool allowed the poison to settle deep in the alveoli, where the gas exchange happens and where the cancer begins. The mercenaries weren't just selling nicotine, they were selling the suppression of pain, ensuring that the body's alarm bells were silenced while the building burned down. But chemistry was not enough for the mercenaries. The ammonia protocol had successfully weaponized the delivery system, yet the hunger for dominance required a more fundamental violation of nature. In the 1980s, under the secret directives of their British overlords, Brown and Williamson embarked on a biological experiment that bordered on science fiction, Project Y1. Deep in the remote agricultural fields of Brazil, far from the prying eyes of the FDA and U.S. regulators, the company began to cultivate a genetically modified strain of tobacco plant. This was not nature's leaf. It was a Frankenstein monster designed for high-velocity addiction. The Y1 strain was engineered to contain twice the nicotine content of normal flue-cured tobacco, a botanical anomaly that did not exist in the wild. This project serves as the ultimate forensic marker of mens rea, the guilty mind. If the company truly believed their public stance that nicotine was simply about taste and flavor, there would be no logical reason to breed the Y1 plant. High nicotine tobacco is notoriously bitter, harsh on the throat, and difficult to cure. It offers no sensory pleasure. The only reason to cultivate it is to increase the narcotic payload of the product. The mercenaries grew it in secret, harvested it in silence, and then, in a move that resembles international drug trafficking more than agriculture, they smuggled millions of pounds of Y1 tobacco into the United States. They blended this supercharged leaf into their best-selling brands like Viceroy, turning unsuspecting customers into test subjects for a genetic experiment. The smoker didn't know they were inhaling a biological weapon. They only knew that when they tried to quit, the physical withdrawal was more violent and the craving was more absolute. With the chemistry perfected, the mercenaries turned their attention to geography. In the boardrooms of Louisville, they laid out maps of American cities, but they were not looking for affluent suburbs. They were hunting for stress. Internal documents reveal a cynicism that chills the blood. Brown and Williamson, through their Cool brand, aggressively targeted the African American community and the urban poor. They identified stress nodes, inner city neighborhoods plagued by poverty and unemployment, and carpet bombed them with billboards. They sponsored jazz festivals, not out of a love for music, but to associate the lethal habit with cultural coolness. They called this targeted marketing, but a forensic psychologist would call it predatory profiling. They understood that people in pain medicate themselves. They knew that a single mother working 2 shifts or a man out of work was biologically primed for the dopamine hit of a cigarette. They positioned their product not as a luxury, but as a cheap, necessary crutch for the downtrodden. The dynasty didn't just extract money. They extracted it from those who could least afford to lose it, transferring wealth from the ghettos of America to the trust funds of the invisible elite. While the marketing department targeted the poor, the engineering department was waging war against the government. The forensic crown jewel of this deception was the Barclay cigarette, launched by Brown and Williamson in the 1980s. The mercenaries faced a problem. The Federal Trade Commission, FTC, used machines to smoke cigarettes and measure tar and nicotine. B&W needed a cigarette that tested clean on the machine, but delivered a massive kick to the human. Their solution was a masterpiece of aerodynamic fraud. They designed a filter with microscopic channels, grooves that acted as air vents. When the rigid metal clamp of the testing machine held the cigarette, the vents remained open, diluting the smoke with fresh air. The machine registered an ultra-low tar reading. But the human mouth is not made of metal. It is made of soft flesh. When a smoker put the Barclay filter between their lips, their soft tissue naturally blocked the vents. The air supply was cut off, and the smoker inhaled the full, lethal dose of tar. Brown and Williamson had effectively designed a filter that could distinguish between a robot and a human victim. It was not a malfunction. It was a smart weapon designed to bypass the radar of public health. If the chemists and geneticists were the architects of this invisible prison, Thomas Sandifer was the warden. Ascending to the role of CEO in the 1990s, Sandifer represented the final, most toxic evolution of the mercenary. He was not a Brown. He was not a creator. He was a corporate soldier, a man who had totally compartmentalized his humanity to serve the machine. To the public, he presented himself as a folksy tobacco executive defending an American tradition against government overreach. To the forensic historian, he was a highly paid perjury machine, the human face of a faceless evil. Sandifer's tenure was defined by the Siege of Truth. He presided over the company at a time when the secrets of ammonia and Y1 were threatening to spill out into the public consciousness. Unlike the old Brown patriarchs of the 19th century, who might have claimed ignorance of the medical consequences, Sandifer operated with full knowledge. He read the internal memos. He saw the reports of rats dying in the inhalation chambers. He knew that the product he sold killed 50% of its long-term users. Yet he viewed his job not as fixing the problem, but as standing as a firewall between the truth and the shareholders' dividend. He was the hardened heart, personified not by tragedy, but by salary, willing to wage war against anyone who dared to peek behind the curtain. Before the wall collapsed, the mercenaries maintained it with a legal strategy known as scorched earth. For decades, Brown and Williamson did not win cases by proving their innocence. They won by bankrupting the victims. Internal memos laid out the doctrine: to delay is to win. When a dying smoker sued the company, B&W did not seek a quick settlement. They unleashed an army of lawyers to drown the plaintiff in paperwork. They would demand deposition after deposition, forcing terminally ill patients to testify from their hospital beds, grilling them for days about their lifestyle, their diet, and their family history. The goal was to exhaust the victim's bank account and their will to live. They famously bragged about spending millions of dollars to defend a case worth only pennies, simply to send a message. If you sue us, we will spend your remaining days on earth making you miserable. This was the weaponization of the legal system. They buried the truth under mountains of motions and appeals, ensuring that most plaintiffs died before a verdict could ever be read. The 1994 perjury and the whistleblower. By the 1980s and 90s, the machinery of Brown and Williamson was running on a terrifying autopilot. The ammonia alchemists and the genetic engineers behind the high-nicotine Y1 tobacco plant were pushing the boundaries of biological warfare. But the Brown family was nowhere to be found in the laboratory. They had become the ghosts of Louisville. The dynasty was now represented not by a blood heir, but by hired executioners, men like Thomas Sandifer, the CEO who had become the face of the company's evil. This era was defined by the absentee scandal. The Brown family allowed their name to remain on the door, lending aristocratic legitimacy to a criminal enterprise, while they insulated themselves from the legal heat. When the genetically modified Y1 tobacco was being smuggled from Brazil, it was not a Brown who signed the manifest. It was the corporate proxies. But the moral stain traveled up the money pipeline, straight to the family trust funds. On April 14, 1994, the timeline of the legacy hit its nadir. The House Subcommittee on Health summoned the 7 most powerful tobacco executives to Washington. In the glare of the cameras, Thomas Sandifer stood up. He was the avatar of the Brown and Williamson brand. When asked the defining question, he looked into the lens and lied. "I believe that nicotine is not addictive." Forensically, this was perjury, but distinctively, it was a perjury of protection. Sandifer was lying to protect a profit margin that flowed back to shareholders and historical beneficiaries. The Brown family, watching from the safety of their high society parlors, remained silent. They did not step forward to correct the record. They did not demand their name be removed from the lie. They let the hired help commit the felony while they enjoyed the dividends. This was the ultimate act of aristocratic cowardice, profitable silence. While Thomas Sandifer and the 7 dwarfs were performing their synchronized perjury in the hearing rooms of Washington, D.C., a far more dangerous chemical reaction was taking place inside the quiet suburbs of Louisville, Kentucky. The catalyst was Dr. Jeffrey Wigand. In the forensic hierarchy of the Brown and Williamson organization, Wigand was an anomaly. He was not a tobacco man by birth or breeding. He was a scientist, a biochemist with a background in the pharmaceutical industry. He had been hired in 1989 as the Vice President of Research and Development with a mandate that sounded noble on paper to develop a safer cigarette. But upon entering the inner sanctum of B&W, Wigand discovered that safety was merely a marketing euphemism. He found the Y1 plants. He found the ammonia blending protocols. He found the carcinogenic casing reports. He realized he had been hired not to cure the disease, but to optimize the vector. When Wigand began to ask questions, specifically about the removal of coumarin, a rat poison and lung carcinogen from pipe tobacco, he collided with the hardened heart culture established by Thomas H. Brown Jr. decades earlier. He was told that science was subservient to sales. He was silenced, marginalized, and finally fired in 1993. But unlike the generations of employees before him who took their severance packages and their secrets to the grave, Wigand refused to accept the omerta. He was a man of volatile integrity, a scientist who could not reconcile the Hippocratic nature of his training with the homicidal nature of his employer. He became the insider. In the eyes of the Brown dynasty, he was a traitor. In the eyes of history, he was the first man to smuggle the truth out of the burning building. The reaction of Brown and Williamson to Wigand's defection was a masterclass in corporate terrorism. The executives, terrified that Wigand would testify about the perjury committed at the Waxman hearings, authorized a kill order on his reputation. They did not send a hitman with a gun. They sent lawyers and private investigators. They assembled a legal and public relations team, known internally as the Viper Team. Their objective was not to debate Wigand's science, because they knew his science was correct, but to destroy his character. They operated on the ancient legal strategy: if you can't kill the message, kill the messenger. The weapon they forged was a document known as the dossier. It was a 500-page compilation of every mistake, every altercation, and every petty grievance in Jeffrey Wigand's life. They scoured his divorce records. They interviewed disgruntled former employees. They twisted minor shoplifting accusations and spousal arguments into a portrait of a pathological liar and a wife-beater. This dossier was printed and distributed to every major news outlet in America. It was a forensic assassination attempt. The Brown family legacy, which had once relied on the dignity of the golden leaf, was now relying on the filth of the gutter. They were willing to spend millions of dollars to paint a whistleblower as a madman, hoping that the media would look at his stained laundry and ignore the carcinogenic stain on the lungs of their customers. The persecution of Dr. Jeffrey Wigand was not merely a legal battle, it was a psychological dismantling. The Viper team employed tactics that seemed lifted from the playbook of the Stasi. They didn't just want to win, they wanted to induce a mental breakdown. Wigand would come home to find objects in his house move slightly, just enough to signal that someone had been there, but not enough to prove it to the police. It was a technique known as gaslighting. He received phone calls at 3 a.m. where silence hung on the line, followed by the click of a recording of his own children's voices. When he drove his car, dark sedans with tinted windows would box him in on the highway, forcing him to the shoulder, only to speed away at the last second. They dug into his past with forensic cruelty, contacting his ex-wife, his former teachers, finding every embarrassing moment of his life to weaponize in the press. The message from the Brown and Williamson mercenaries was clear. We own reality. We can touch you. We can destroy your mind before we even touch your body. It was corporate terrorism, funded by the profits of the very product Wigand was trying to expose. For the CEO Thomas Sandifer and the executive class, this campaign was a desperate defense of the family fortune. They knew that Wigand held the key to the crime-fraud exception. If he testified that the lawyers had knowingly advised the company to hide research, the attorney-client privilege would shatter and the floodgates of litigation would open. The intimidation of Wigand was a calculated investment in the survival of the lie. It revealed the total moral collapse of the corporation. They were no longer just negligent manufacturers. They were active persecutors, using the tactics of the Stasi to silence a man who simply wanted to tell the truth about ammonia. The climax of this shadow war occurred on February 4th, 1996. Despite the threats, despite the dossier, and despite a preliminary injunction from a Kentucky court, Jeffrey Wigand sat down in front of the cameras of CBS's 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace. The interview was the Zapruder film of the tobacco industry. It was the moment the headshot was delivered to the corporate body. Wigand looked into the camera, his face weary but resolute, and uttered the words that would be engraved on the tombstone of the Brown and Williamson reputation. We are in the nicotine delivery business. He confirmed everything. He confirmed the ammonia. He confirmed the why one. He confirmed that the CEOs had lied under oath. He confirmed that light cigarettes were a fraud. Forensically, this broadcast was the social death of the Brown dynasty. Millions of Americans watched as the veil was ripped away. They saw that the gentleman smoker was a myth, and that the reality was a cynically engineered addiction machine. The power of the dossier evaporated in the face of Wigand's specific scientific detail. The public realized that you don't need to be a saint to tell the truth about sinners. The broadcast destroyed the credibility of the Seven Dwarfs forever. It marked the end of the era where tobacco executives could walk into a country club without being stared at as pariahs. The aftermath of the Wigand revelation was a slow-motion demolition of the empire. The legal walls crumbled. The attorneys general of dozens of states filed suit, armed with Wigand's testimony and the internal documents that flowed in his wake. The crime-fraud exception was invoked, and the secret library of Brown and Williamson was laid bare for the world to see. The family, the heirs of Thomas Sr. and Thomas Jr., watched as their legacy was dissected in courtrooms across the nation. The corporate perjury had failed, the lie had been exposed. The Brown and Williamson name, once a badge of Kentucky pride, became a synonym for deceit. The company would eventually be absorbed, merged, and renamed, its identity diluted into the conglomerate soup of British American Tobacco, BAT, and Reynolds American. But the stain remains. The insider had won. He had survived the smear campaign and delivered the fatal blow. The dynasty that had started with a cough and built a fortune on a hardened heart ended in disgrace, stripped of its secrets and its honor. The laboratory lights were turned off, the Y1 plants were plowed under, but the dossier of their crimes was now a matter of public record, a permanent autopsy of a business model built on the betrayal of human life. Laundering blood money into whiskey. On November 23, 1998, the long, bloody century of the Brown and Williamson dynasty culminated not in a prison cell, but in a hotel ballroom. The event was the signing of the Master Settlement Agreement, MSA, a legal accord of such staggering financial magnitude that it reshaped the American economy. To the casual observer, it appeared to be the unconditional surrender of the tobacco industry. The attorneys general of 46 states had cornered the giants, Brown and Williamson, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, and Lorillard, and forced them to sign a treaty ending the tobacco wars. The headline number was astronomical, $206 billion to be paid out over 25 years. It was the largest civil litigation settlement in human history. The press framed it as a moment of biblical justice, the day the merchants of death were finally forced to pay for the carnage they had engineered. However, a forensic analysis of the MSA reveals a far more cynical reality. It was not a surrender. It was a purchase of survival. The executives of Brown and Williamson, the successors to the hardened heart of Thomas Jr., and the perjury of the 1994 executives had done the math. They realized that facing thousands of individual lawsuits and 50 separate state Medicaid recovery suits would result in a death by 1,000 cuts. It would bankrupt the company and likely lead to criminal indictments for racketeering. So, they chose to cut a deal. The MSA was essentially a global peace treaty that granted the companies immunity from future state lawsuits regarding tobacco-related health care costs. In exchange for the money, the industry bought certainty. They bought the right to continue existing. They bought a license to sell their lethal product without the constant fear of a state-sponsored execution. The signing of the MSA was the ultimate act of corporate pragmatism. They monetized their guilt, converted it into a line item on a balance sheet, and amortized it over a quarter of a century. While the money garnered the headlines, the true forensic victory of the MSA was the sunlight provision. As part of the settlement, Brown and Williamson and its co-conspirators were forced to dissolve the Tobacco Institute, their propaganda arm, and, most critically, to release millions of pages of internal documents to the public. This was the secret library that Jeffrey Wigand had warned the world about. For decades, these documents had been shielded by the attorney-client privilege, hidden in the salt mines and secure storage facilities of the legal teams. Now they were uploaded to the internet. The release of these papers was the equivalent of a corporate autopsy. It allowed forensic historians, epidemiologists, and prosecutors to dissect the brain of the beast. The documents confirmed every suspicion and every conspiracy theory. There, in black and white, were the memos from the 1960s admitting that nicotine was addictive. There were the reports on the ammonia technology, explicitly detailing how to increase the kick of the smoke. There were the marketing plans targeting replacement smokers, a grotesque euphemism for teenagers, to replace the older customers who were dying off. The Y1 genetic project was laid bare, exposing the biological manipulation of the plant. The dossier on Wigan was exposed as a calculated smear campaign. The Brown and Williamson legacy was stripped of its last shred of dignity. The old money veneer was dissolved by the acid of their own handwriting. The world could see that for 40 years, the captains of this industry had sat in rooms and calmly discussed how to maximize the lethality of their product while minimizing their liability. It was a portrait of sociopathy on an industrial scale. The most devastating forensic revelation of the MSA, however, lies in the economics of the payment. Who actually paid the $206 billion? It was not the Brown Family Trust. It was not the shareholders of British American Tobacco, which would eventually absorb B&W. It was the addict. The structure of the settlement allowed the tobacco companies to pass the cost of the fine directly to the consumer. In the immediate aftermath of the MSA, the price of a pack of cigarettes rose by approximately 45 cents. This price hike was calculated with actuarial precision to cover the annual payments to the states. This created a perverse economic loop. The victims of the Brown and Williamson conspiracy, the working-class smokers, the addicted teenagers, the dying veterans, were the ones funding the settlement. The company acted merely as a collection agent. They collected the blood money from the lungs of the poor and transferred it to the treasuries of the states. Forensically, this is a laundering mechanism. The corporation did not bleed, the customer bled twice. First, they paid with their health, then they paid for the company's punishment. The Brown dynasty's wealth remained largely insulated. The dividends continued to flow. The executives continued to receive their bonuses. The MSA, rather than destroying the companies, actually stabilized them. It turned the state governments into silent partners. Because the states now relied on the annual tobacco payments to balance their budgets, they had a financial incentive to ensure that Brown and Williamson stayed in business. The autopsy revealed that the patient, the corporation, was not dead. It had simply been grafted onto the state, creating a symbiotic parasite that fed on the citizenry to sustain both the government and the shareholder. In the years following the settlement, Brown and Williamson engaged in a frantic attempt to whitewash its history. The billboards came down. The cartoon mascots, like Joe Camel, though a Reynolds property, represented the industry tactic, vanished. The companies launched youth smoking prevention campaigns, slick televised public service announcements that portrayed them as responsible corporate citizens. But forensically, these campaigns were a sham. Internal studies showed that the anti-smoking ads produced by the tobacco companies often had a reverse psychology effect, making smoking seem like a forbidden adult activity that appealed to rebellious teens. The new Brown and Williamson tried to present itself as a reformed sinner. They admitted that smoking causes cancer, a concession mandated by the MSA. They admitted that nicotine is addictive. But these admissions were hollow. They were legal requirements, not moral epiphanies. The factories in Louisville and Macon kept running. The ammonia was still in the blend, though less discussed. The Y1 technology was ostensibly retired, but the knowledge of how to manipulate nicotine remained. The company had essentially bought a clean slate. They had paid a fortune to erase the perjury of Thomas Sandifer. They washed the blood off the floor with a fire hose of cash, and then they went back to work. The $206 billion autopsy concluded that the subject was guilty of mass homicide, but because the subject was a corporation and not a person. The punishment was a fee, not a sentence. The legacy of the Brown dynasty was preserved in the amber of financial settlement, a fossil of American greed that proved that if you kill enough people, you don't go to jail. You just negotiate terms. In the wake of the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement, a strange and infuriating pathology emerged: the Great Dissociation. While the Brown and Williamson name was dragged through the mud, eventually being dissolved into R.J. Reynolds and British American Tobacco, the Brown family themselves pulled off the greatest magic trick in corporate history. They vanished into their other empire, whiskey. Because they had structurally separated themselves from the operational management years prior, the social necrosis that killed the tobacco brand did not kill the family fortune. They successfully pivoted their identity. To the modern world, they became the titans of Brown-Forman, the purveyors of Jack Daniels and Woodford Reserve. They traded the ashtray for the crystal tumbler. Forensically, this is money laundering on a historical scale. The capital that built the whiskey empire was originally harvested from the tobacco fields. The old money that now funds their philanthropy and secures their seats on museum boards is radioactive, with the half-life of the crimes committed in the 20th century. They are the unpunished. They live in a sanitized bubble of luxury, their bloody footprints washed away by the tide of time and the complexity of modern finance, proving that if you are rich enough, you can outlive your own sins. They are the final victims of the dynasty, spiritually hollowed out, possessing everything but owning nothing, because everything they have is stolen from the breath of strangers. Ultimately, the goal of the Brown dynasty in the 21st century became erasure. They sought to disappear. The merger of Brown and Williamson with R.J. Reynolds in 2004 to form Reynolds American was the final act of this vanishing trick. The name Brown and Williamson, the name that George Garvin Brown painted on the brick factory in 1893, was taken down. The corporate letterhead was shredded. The identity was dissolved into a conglomerate soup. This was the corporate witness protection program. By killing the brand, they hoped to kill the memory. Today you will not find a Brown and Williamson cigarette on the shelf. You will find brands like Camel, Reynolds, Newport, or Pall Mall, owned by British American Tobacco. The specific entity that committed the crimes of Y1 and ammonia has been legally metabolized, but the money remains. The social necrosis was the price they paid to keep the loot. The name died so the fortune could live. The Brown family has successfully faded into the background noise of the global super rich, indistinguishable from any other billionaire clan, their bloody footprints washed away by the tide of time and the complexity of modern finance. But in the forensic dossier, the fingerprint remains indelible, a legacy of ash, silence, and the quiet suffocation of the truth. The corporate entity known as Brown and Williamson officially ceased to exist in 2004 when its American operations were merged with R.J. Reynolds, creating Reynolds American Inc., which was subsequently fully acquired by British American Tobacco, BAT. In the legal ledger, the case is closed. The tax ID number was retired. But in the forensic ledger, the organism did not die. It mutated. The disappearance of the B&W name was not a funeral. It was a molting. The conglomerate shed its old scarred skin, stained with the perjury of 1994 and the blackened lungs of the 20th century, to reveal a sleek, new electronic form. The modern iteration of the tobacco industry, dominated by the very capital that the Brown family helped amass, has pivoted from the combustible era to the aerosol era. This is the electronic mutation. The industry looked at the dying demographic of cigarette smokers and realized they needed a new host for their parasite. They found it in the concept of harm reduction, a cynical co-opting of public health language. They launched e-cigarettes and vaping devices like Views, a flagship product of the conglomerate that absorbed B&W. These devices are the spiritual successors to the ammonia experiments of the mercenaries in the 1960s. They are clean, metallic, and technologically advanced. They look like USB drives, not cancer sticks. But inside, the logic is identical. They are delivery systems for nicotine, designed to create the same biological dependency that built the mansions of Louisville. If the ammonia alchemists of the 1950s were the dark wizards of the industry, the flavor engineers of the 2020s are their heirs. The forensic parallel is terrifying. The chemists used ammonia to make the smoke smoother and the kick harder. The modern industry uses benzoic acid to create nicotine salts. This chemical innovation allows for massive concentrations of nicotine to be inhaled without the harsh throat hit that naturally limits consumption. It is the Y1 project perfected. A single vape pod can contain as much nicotine as a pack of cigarettes, yet it tastes like creme brulee or cool mint. This is the candy-coated trap. The industry, having been banned from advertising to children with Joe Camel, found a loophole in the chemistry itself. They flavored the poison by masking the bitter alkaline taste of the drug with synthetic sweetness. They lowered the barrier to entry for a new generation. The replacement smokers are no longer teenagers lighting up behind the bleachers. They are middle schoolers vaping in the bathrooms. The dynasty's legacy has evolved from a dirty, ash-producing habit to a sterile, invisible addiction. The delivery method has changed, but the predation remains constant. The money that flows into the trust funds of the invisible brown heirs today is generated by the same neurochemical hijacking, merely updated for the digital age. The tragic irony of the Brown and Williamson saga is that the tobacco wars were never truly won by the public. They were merely settled. The Master Settlement Agreement of 1998 was intended to bleed the industry dry. Yet the industry is more profitable today than it was then. They streamlined their operations, raised their prices, and diversified their portfolios. The social necrosis destroyed the family name, but it did not destroy the family wealth. The capital accumulated from a century of induced emphysema is now safely tucked away in diversified hedge funds, immune to the coughing of the victims. The Brown dynasty proves a chilling forensic theorem. In American capitalism, if you kill enough people slowly enough, and if you generate enough profit while doing it, you become too big to punish. You become a structural component of the economy. The mercenaries like Thomas Sandifer lived in the shame of the perjury. But the founding family? They vanished into the safety of wealth. The machine they built, the nicotine pump, has achieved immortality. It has survived science, it has survived law, and it has survived shame. We close the dossier on the Brown and Williamson dynasty with a verdict of guilty but at large. The crime scene is not a single room, it is the collective respiratory system of the global population. The weapon is not a gun, it is a chemically engineered molecule. The motive was not passion, it was the cold, mathematical extraction of value from human life. The history of the Brown family is the history of the perfect crime. They sold a product that killed their customers. They knew it killed them. Yet they walked away with billions before the bill came due. There was no biological justice for the founders. There was only the comfortable silence of their estates. The factory whistle in Louisville may be silent, but the ghosts of the ashen legions of the Brown Empire have company now. A silent army of the suffocated marching behind a hearse made of gold, driven by a dynasty that escaped the crime scene almost a century ago.